Reading my Herald today, and it would seem that recent events over the last few weeks, and particularly over the last few days, and crucially over this week's question time, Prime Minister's questions, have brought the Herald editor into some focus in terms of what he expects and has succeeded, I believe, today in getting from his opinion columnists. Well, most of them, that is to say, were mercifully saved from the vapourings of Mark Smith on politics. So let's look at where we are. Alison wrote, fine columnist, fine command of English. Never quite sure where she stands constitutionally, but I mean, that's a fair position for any opinion columnist to take. They either want to pin their colours to the mast so that you know what they stand for, or they want to maintain a detached position on commentary. And I respect that when it's done well. And Alison has fascinating things to say. And our headline sums it up in a moderate but penetrating way. Don't look now, Mr. Sunak, this tale has a long way to go yet. So that was the way it struck me too. Prime Minister's question, can I give my overall impression of it? Rishi Sunak, who many had seen as being a rather cosy, affable young man, and had a certain level of liking and conditional respect, unless you looked hard at his record or his wealth or his behaviour in relation to his and his wife's income. A nice little man. That was dispelled fairly rapidly as soon as he got to his feet. And what did he turn out to be? He turned out to be a braying, strident Tory, playing the Johnson game of putting out his bongos and turning alternately to look at the baying mob on his back benches for approbation, something Johnson was very fond of doing, and sedulously avoiding answering any question, bouncing back with the normal Tory deflections, which were calculated to gain roars from the boneheaded masses behind him. So that was my impression, which was very slightly biased. Alison is more balanced than I, but she comes up with some good thoughts and good ideas. He promised to put integrity, professionalism and accountability at the heart of his government. How does he start off by doing that? By doing, and this is what apparently the opposition leaders believe, Keir Starmer certainly believed, Ian Blackford certainly believed, well, I believe that he did a sordid little deal with Suella Braverman to reinstate her if she dropped out and supported his candidacy. I mean, to say that it doesn't bear close scrutiny, it doesn't bear any scrutiny at all. It's an appalling act of cynicism and so blatant. So she goes on to say, she lost her job because she had emailed a confidential document from her personal email account to a backbench colleague. What does it say about Mr. Sunak that he did not see anything wrong with the reappointment and was prepared to defend it to the hilt at his Prime Minister's questions? Was he pushed into such a toxic position because he needed to beg the support of the right in his divided party, or did he jump of his own free will? Either way, it stinks. Well said, Alison. Later on, she goes on to talk about his wealth. It was enough being told by George Osborne, the original austerity chancellor, that we were all in this together. Imagine hearing that message from Messrs. Sunak and Hunt. What does respecting SNP mean, and what's the SNP's reaction to it? Perhaps summed up in a phrase as, the problem is that the SNP doesn't want a constructive relationship with Westminster. Although that's a bit strong, I understand the thought behind it. The purpose of SNP is to say Westminster is not and never has been governing Scotland effectively, and we need to get the hell out of it. And that places them regularly as a devolved government with members of Parliament in Westminster in difficult positions. So let's see what Rebecca has to say about this, all of it relevant. For all the talk of constructive dialogue, Sturgeon, and working together closely, Sunak, a warm, positive relationship between UK and Scottish governments is not going to materialise. Certainly it can't possibly under the circumstances. And I wish we'd stop playing patty cake and pretending it will. The fundamental problem is that the SNP doesn't want it, with apologies for how cynical that sounds. Well, it's not cynical. It's a realistic position with a devolved government, reluctantly devolved, but glad to have some measure of influence on a parliament and the civil service and the police and the health service and all that goes with it, but determined to get, I hope, determined to get the hell out of the Union. So that's fair enough. The Scottish government's tried and tested political formula is to demonstrate in any way possible that one, devolution can't work, and two, it's under existential threat from the nasty Tories anyway. Spot on. Good on you, Rebecca. Rebecca goes on to say, UK ministers need to learn that this sort of approach to the Scottish government is not just disrespectful to the SNP, as they imagine, but disrespectful to Scottish voters. She's talking about the overall approach of general contempt, denial of democratic rights, etc. However, she goes on to say something I'm a bit equivocal about. The very many Scottish voters who are fundamentally union supporting but infinitely prefer the more compassionate centre-left domestic government that they have in Scotland to the chaotic, incompetent right-wing one that they've had to put up with in Westminster. Well, the parts of that I agree with will be evident to you. However, it does beg the question of this idea that somehow SNP governments are elected in significant part by people who do not support independence but like a devolved, contained SNP. Well, I don't believe there's any substantial electoral evidence for that. There undoubtedly will be some such people. And all I can say is they haven't thought through very keenly the opposition to independence if they vote for a party, particularly in 2016, who explicitly stated that they and the Greens with them were determined to get an independence referendum, determined to get full sovereign independence, and would pursue it vigorously. And any evidence, in inverted commas, that such people exist in any numbers relies on some sort of interpretation of exit polls or questionnaires, often by bodies and media that are hostile to Scottish independence. So I don't believe for a minute there's a large block of people voting for SNP who are hostile to independence. It's a face-saving thing for Tories particularly, and Labour, unionists in general, for why the SNP repeatedly becomes the solid, undeniable choice of the Scottish electorate. Anything else from Rebecca? Yes? Going back on devolution. If Tony Blair has denied Scotland its parliament, all hell would have broken loose. But many Tories are hopelessly lost to this way of thinking. Their instinct is that Scotland needs to be brought to heel. Will they never learn? So, good considered stuff and some good points made, and perhaps a point inadvertently deconstructed by me that Rebecca didn't intend to make, that the evidence for large blocks of people voting SNP who are hostile to independence, I believe, to use my favourite word, is bollocks, as always. Now, where are we? Yes, perhaps the most interesting one for me is Neil Mackay. But today, he's on what I perceive as sharp focus and some very useful political analysis, which despite him winning many awards, I think mainly from his colleagues in the industry for his writing, which baffles me, to be honest. I mean, if I compare any Neil Mackay column with almost any column in the Guardian, it doesn't stand in the same league. But today he's on Good Focus, and his headline is the FM bold enough to go for election nuclear option, for the election nuclear option, which is what he means. And the theme, really, of it is a question that's been in my mind since, at least since the 2016 Holyrood election, since the 2017 snap election, which Nicola was caught flat-footed by, God knows why, because anybody with half an eye could see that that election was highly likely. And the theme is really the question, is this another lost moment for the FM? Is it another open goal where Nicola, instead of kicking the ball, turns around and addresses the terracing with a series of questions, or pats a baby, or goes on a chat show? More words, zero action. So that's my interpretation of it. But Neil makes some fascinating points in it, ones that had, I suppose they were in the back of my mind, but they really escaped me, and he brings them into focus, and I'm grateful for that. Among the public, the sense is that there's a moral imperative for another Westminster election. Events of the last 3 months have been unique and shocking. Britain was put in danger by its own government, the economy trashed, the country's international standing traduced, and ordinary citizens left facing the financial fallout to mortgages, pensions and household bills. That's a strong, coherent and forceful paragraph, and I thank him for that. He goes on to touch on the Suella Braverman farce. Just days after she was forced to resign over a security breach doesn't speak of a safe pair of hands, it speaks of damaged judgment, as did the Rwanda comment. I mean, anybody with any sense of humanity or equity or justice or feeling for their fellow human beings who could have listened to the kind of things Suella Braverman said on Rwanda, there's something seriously deficient in their psyche as far as I'm concerned. The right-wing press hails Mr. Sunak as the new adult in the room, despite the new Prime Minister being fully responsible for the shambles of governance which has plagued Britain for years. It's notable that these same right-wing newspapers recently hailed Miss Truss as the nation's saviour, although that appears to have slipped their minds of late. It's fascinating that the right-wing press, the Mail, the Telegraph, the Express, the Sun to some degree falls into that category, have been wrong about almost everything. Every forecast they made, every headline that they had that celebrated a new arrival on the ever-shifting stage of Tory leaders and Prime Minister, they've been wrong all the time. And of course, I don't believe that this is sheer ineptness or lack of journalistic ability. It's sheer cynical denial of the facts because the facts don't fit their predetermined narrative. An appalling state for newspapers to be in. But it's been that way since, I suppose, the yellow press in the States. What else does Neil have to say? He's got very good things to say. Politically, the SNP and Labour across Britain risk losing the initiative against Mr. Sunak. He may not be a safe pair of hands or the adult in the room, but he's not Mr. Johnson or Miss Truss. So, did I get that right? Yeah, that's the way it reads. And yeah, I mean, wee Rishi is the nice smiling wee guy, and we have to pay tribute to the undeniable fact that he's the first South Asian to be a Prime Minister of Great Britain, and in a sense it was the last nail in the coffin of the vestiges of the Raj. So it must have raised a smile not only across India, but across Pakistan as well. Right, big question, big, 64 billion Scottish currency, pound, dollar, you name it. So what does Miss Sturgeon do beyond merely making demands which won't prick Mr. Sunak's conscience or compel him to take the politically suicidal step of calling an independence, calling an election when his party's fortunes have never been worse? Well, Miss Sturgeon does have a few options, though none is good. She could call a Holyrood debate, which he dismisses, I think rightly. Should she lead national protests? Nicola has been absolutely dedicated in her avoidance of putting herself at the front of any protest. I mean, there were one or two isolated things, and during the 2014 referendum campaign, she put herself up front when it was safe to do so. But as far as leading march, waving on a banner and big issues, Nicola, undeniable publicity hog when it suits her, avoids these things because they all involve a clear-cut commitment. And I have to say, that is one of Nicola's weaknesses. She has an innate lawyer's caution which pushes the boundaries almost to timidity and a risk avoidance mentality. She either has a faulty capacity to assess risk, the risks and benefits, or she's just not prepared to take them. And that worries me, in an independence leader particularly. Well, should she lead national protests? There are demonstrations in London on Guy Fawkes Day demanding another election. Would Miss Sturgeon get involved? She isn't a politician of the streets, that's pretty clear. Good insight, concisely stated, Neil. Thanks for that. The only other real option, this is the fascinating one, the only other real option for Miss Sturgeon would be the nuclear option, collapsing Holyrood and calling for a Scottish election as a way of exerting moral and political pressure on Mr. Sunak. And Neil goes on to explain, and it's useful to have this set out, although I was aware of this, but it hasn't been at the forefront of my mind, and it should have been. I'd lost sight of it as an option, and I don't know if SNP must have considered it, and one of their army of overpaid, expensive advisors must have brought it up. What they made of it, God only knows. The Scotland Act says Parliament can be dissolved and an extraordinary general election called if 2/3 of MSPs back the resolution. Now, the worm in that apple is, to get 2/3 of the MPs, they would have to enlist the support of Tories, highly unlikely, and Labour and Lib Dems. But it is an option, and it would be, is it worth trying it in the knowledge that it might fail, or some might say would be certain to fail? Difficult one, but something like that, something that is a bold action that challenges, it's what we need from you, Nicola. I don't want to hear any more calling on the Westminster government to do this, Ian Blackford standing up and doing his parliamentarian, sometimes feeling, I think, for me, embarrassingly comfortable in the cosy role of being a public figure from the opposition benches in Westminster. And I hope not, but I fear that coziness and complacency may have affected a lot of the long-sitting MPs. There is also, of course, one that Neil doesn't address, the Sinn Féin option. Fight the election, get the seat, and then don't take the seat. And that demands a whole series of complex evaluations of its own. But Nicola has to find an act of defiance, an act of frontal challenge. Independence is a frontal challenge to a monolithic state that you want to escape from. It cannot be pain-free. It's a question of rationally limiting the pain, because as a comfortably salaried member of Parliament, or one of the many parliaments, is you're cushioned from economic risk, and that's the perception of the people, whereas at the front end there are people who could be hurt economically by it, psychologically by it, and quite tangibly in certain levels of confrontation, physically by it. But these options have to be examined. So what else does Neil go on to say? Unlike mistrust, Mr. Sunak has already called Miss Sturgeon. It appears to have been a relatively cordial exchange. She's wished him well, etc., etc., etc. So we're stuck in the realm of talk. Miss Sturgeon and Mr. Stammer, I think it says Miss Stammer here, can make all the demands they want, but Mr. Sunak won't budge. Why would he? We're left then with the likelihood of Mr. Sunak in power until January 2025 at the latest, support for Labour and SNP potentially ebbing, and a crucial moment for the Yes movement lost. That's the risk, and it is a huge, terrifying risk. It must be evident to Nicola, it must be evident to every SNP and Green MP and MSP. It's staring them in the face. If they are hatching major radical plans, for God's sake, open out at least to trusted figures within the Yes movement, so that they can get squarely behind you instead of constantly worrying, is this truly an independence government and independence leader that we have and that we voted into power? So on that somber note, I'll try and grin and